Athénaïse. Chapter 1. Athénaïse went away in the morning to make a visit to her parents, 10 miles back on Rigolet de Bon Dieu. She did not return in the evening, and Cazot, her husband, fretted not a little. He did not worry much about Athénaïse, who, he suspected, was resting only too content in the bosom of her family. His chief solicitude was manifestly for the pony she had ridden. He felt sure those lazy pigs, her brothers, were capable of neglecting it seriously. This misgiving Cazot communicated to his servant, old Félicite, who waited upon him at supper. His voice was low-pitched, and even softer than Félicite's. He was tall, sinewy, swarthy, and altogether severe-looking. His thick black hair waved, and it gleamed like the breast of a crow. The sweep of his mustache, which was not so black, outlined the broad contour of the mouth. Beneath the under lip grew a small tuft which he was much given to twisting, and which he permitted to grow, apparently for no other purpose. Cazot's eyes were dark blue, narrow and overshadowed. His hands were coarse and stiff from close acquaintance with farming tools and implements, and he handled his fork and knife clumsily. But he was distinguished-looking, and succeeded in commanding a good deal of respect, and even fear sometimes. He ate his supper alone, by the light of a single coal-oil lamp that but faintly illuminated the big room, with its bare floor and huge rafters, and its heavy pieces of furniture that loomed dimly in the gloom of the apartment. Félicite, ministering to his wants, hovered about the table like a little, bent, restless shadow. She served him with a dish of sunfish fried crisp and brown. There was nothing else set before him beside the bread and butter and the bottle of red wine which she locked carefully in the buffet after he had poured his second glass. She was occupied with her mistress's absence, and kept reverting to it after he had expressed his solicitude about the pony. "Dat beat me. Ani Mary tout mont, and got de head turn ready to go broad. C'est pas crétin, tenez." Cazot shrugged his shoulders for answer, after he had drained his glass and pushed aside his plate. Félicite's opinion of the unchristian-like behavior of his wife in leaving him thus alone after 2 months of marriage weighed little with him. He was used to solitude, and did not mind a day or a night or two of it. He had lived alone 10 years, since his first wife died, and Félicite might have known better than to suppose that he cared. He told her she was a fool. It sounded like a compliment in his modulated, caressing voice. She grumbled to herself as she set about clearing the table, and Cazot arose and walked outside on the gallery. His spur, which he had not removed upon entering the house, jangled at every step. The night was beginning to deepen, and to gather black about the clusters of trees and shrubs that were grouped in the yard. In the beam of light from the open kitchen door a black boy stood feeding a brace of snarling, hungry dogs. Further away, on the steps of a cabin, someone was playing the accordion. And in still another direction a little Negro baby was crying lustily. Cazot walked around to the front of the house, which was square, squat and one-story. A belated wagon was driving in at the gate, and the impatient driver was swearing hoarsely at his jaded oxen. Félicite stepped out on the gallery, glass and polishing towel in hand, to investigate, and to wonder, too, who could be singing out on the river. It was a party of young people paddling around, waiting for the moon to rise, and they were singing Juanita, their voices coming tempered and melodious through the distance and the night. Cazot's horse was waiting, saddled, ready to be mounted, for Cazot had many things to attend to before bedtime. So many things that there was not left to him a moment in which to think of Athénaïse. He felt her absence, though, like a dull, insistent pain. However, before he slept that night he was visited by the thought of her, and by a vision of her fair young face with its drooping lips and sullen and averted eyes. The marriage had been a blunder. He had only to look into her eyes to feel that, to discover her growing aversion. But it was a thing not by any possibility to be undone. He was quite prepared to make the best of it, and expected no less than a like effort on her part. The less she revisited the Rigolet, the better. He would find means to keep her at home hereafter. These unpleasant reflections kept Cazot awake far into the night, notwithstanding the craving of his whole body for rest and sleep. The moon was shining, and its pale effulgence reached dimly into the room, and with it a touch of the cool breath of the spring night. There was an unusual stillness abroad. No sound to be heard save the distant, tireless, plaintive notes of the accordion. Chapter 2. Athénaïse did not return the following day, even though her husband sent her word to do so by her brother, Monticlin, who passed on his way to the village early in the morning. On the third day Cazot saddled his horse and went himself in search of her. She had sent no word, no message, explaining her absence, and he felt that he had good cause to be offended. It was rather awkward to have to leave his work, even though late in the afternoon. Cazot had always so much to do. But among the many urgent calls upon him, the task of bringing his wife back to a sense of her duty seemed to him for the moment paramount. The Michis, Athénaïse's parents, lived on the old Gautrain place. It did not belong to them, they were running it for a merchant in Alexandria. The house was far too big for their use. One of the lower rooms served for the storing of wood and tools, the person occupying the place before Michi having pulled up the flooring in despair of being able to patch it. Upstairs, the rooms were so large, so bare, that they offered a constant temptation to lovers of the dance, whose importunities Madame Michi was accustomed to meet with amiable indulgence. A dance at Michi's and a plate of Madame Michi's gumbo file at midnight were pleasures not to be neglected or despised, unless by such serious souls as Cazot. Long before Cazot reached the house his approach had been observed, for there was nothing to obstruct the view of the outer road. Vegetation was not yet abundantly advanced, and there was but a patchy, straggling stand of cotton and corn in Michi's field. Madame Michi, who had been seated on the gallery in a rocking chair, stood up to greet him as he drew near. She was short and fat, and wore a black skirt and loose muslin sack fastened at the throat with a hair brooch. Her own hair, brown and glossy, showed but a few threads of silver. Her round pink face was cheery, and her eyes were bright and good-humored. But she was plainly perturbed and ill at ease as Cazot advanced. Monticlin, who was there too, was not ill at ease, and made no attempt to disguise the dislike with which his brother-in-law inspired him. He was a slim, wiry fellow of 25, short of stature like his mother, and resembling her in feature. He was in shirt-sleeves, half leaning, half sitting, on the insecure railing of the gallery, and fanning himself with his broad-rimmed felt hat. Cochon. He muttered under his breath as Cazot mounted the stairs, Sacre Cochon. Cochon had sufficiently characterized the man who had once on a time declined to lend Monticlin money. But when this same man had had the presumption to propose marriage to his well-beloved sister, Athénaïse, and the honor to be accepted by her, Monticlin felt that a qualifying epithet was needed fully to express his estimate of Cazot. Michi and his oldest son were absent. They both esteemed Cazot highly, and talked much of his qualities of head and heart, and thought much of his excellent standing with city merchants. Athénaïse had shut herself up in her room. Cazot had seen her rise and enter the house at perceiving him. He was a good deal mystified, but no one could have guessed it when he shook hands with Madame Michi. He had only nodded to Monticlin, with a muttered, "Comment cava? Tiens. Something told me you were coming today," exclaimed Madame Michi, with a little blustering appearance of being cordial and at ease, as she offered Cazot a chair. He ventured a short laugh as he seated himself. "You know, nothing would do," she went on, with much gesture of her small, plump hands, "nothing would do but Athénaïse muse stay last night fo a le dance. The boys wooed n year to their sister leaving." Cazot shrugged his shoulders significantly, telling as plainly as words that he knew nothing about it. Comment. Monticlin didn't tell you we were going to keep Athénaïse? Monticlin had evidently told nothing. "And how about the night before?" questioned Cazot, "and last night? It isn't possible you dance every night out here on the Bon Dieu." Madame Michi laughed, with amiable appreciation of the sarcasm. And turning to her son, Monticlin, my boy, go tell yo sister that Monsieur Cazot is here. Monticlin did not stir except to shift his position and settle himself more securely on the railing. Did you hear me, Monticlin? Oh yes, I heard you plain enough, responded her son, but you know as well as me it's no use to tell the Nés anything. You been talkin' to her yoSEF since Monday, and Pa's preached himself hoSE on the subject, and you even had Uncle Akil down here yesterday to reason with her. When the Nés said she wasn't goin' to set her foot back in Cazot's house, she meant it. This speech, which Monticlin delivered with thorough unconcern, threw his mother into a condition of painful but dumb embarrassment. It brought 2 fiery red spots to Cazot's cheeks, and for the space of a moment he looked wicked. What Monticlin had spoken was quite true, though his taste in the manner and choice of time and place in saying it were not of the best. Athénaïse, upon the first day of her arrival, had announced that she came to stay, having no intention of returning under Cazot's roof. The announcement had scattered consternation, as she knew it would. She had been implored, scolded, entreated, stormed at, until she felt herself like a dragging sail that all the winds of heaven had beaten upon. Why in the name of God had she married Cazot? Her father had lashed her with the question a dozen times. Why indeed? It was difficult now for her to understand why, unless because she supposed it was customary for girls to marry when the right opportunity came. Cazot, she knew, would make life more comfortable for her. And again, she had liked him, and had even been rather flustered when he pressed her hands and kissed them, and kissed her lips and cheeks and eyes, when she accepted him. Monticlin himself had taken her aside to talk the thing over. The turn of affairs was delighting him. Come, now, the Nés, you muse explain to me all about it, so we can settle on a good cause, an secu, a separation fou. Has he been mistreating and abusing you, the sacre cochon? They were alone together in her room, whither she had taken refuge from the angry domestic elements. You please to reserve yo disgusting expressions, Monticlin. No, he has not abused me in any way that I can think. Does he drink? Come, the Nés, think well over it. Does he ever get drunk? Drunk? Oh, mercy, no, Cazot never gets drunk. I see. It's just simply you feel like me, you hate him. No, I don't hate him, she returned reflectively, adding with a sudden impulse, it's just being married that I despise. I hate being Mrs. Cazot, and would want to be Athénaïse Michi again. I can't stand to live with a man, to have him always there, his coats and pantaloons hanging in my room. His ugly bare feet, washing them in my tub, before my very eyes, ugh. She shuddered with recollections, and resumed, with a sigh that was almost a sob, mon Dieu, mon Dieu. Sister Marie-Angelique knew what she was saying. She knew me better than myself when she said God had sent me a vocation and I was turning deaf ears. When I think of a blessed life in the convent, at peace. Oh, what was I dreaming of, and then the tears came. Monticlin felt disconcerted and greatly disappointed at having obtained evidence that would carry no weight with a court of justice. The day had not come when a young woman might ask the court's permission to return to her mamma on the sweeping ground of a constitutional disinclination for marriage. But if there was no way of untying this Gordian knot of marriage, there was surely a way of cutting it. Well, the Nés, I'm mighty dern sorry yo got no better grounds than what you say. But you can count on me to stand by you whatever you do. God knows I don't blame you not wantin' to live with Cazot. And now there was Cazot himself, with the red spots flaming in his swarthy cheeks, looking and feeling as if he wanted to thrash Monticlin into some semblance of decency. He arose abruptly, and approaching the room which he had seen his wife enter, thrust open the door after a hasty preliminary knock. Athénaïse, who was standing erect at a far window, turned at his entrance. She appeared neither angry nor frightened, but thoroughly unhappy, with an appeal in her soft dark eyes and a tremor on her lips that seemed to him expressions of unjust reproach. That wounded and maddened him at once. But whatever he might feel, Cazaux knew only one way to act toward a woman. "Athénaïse, you are not ready?" he asked in his quiet tones. "It's getting late, we haven't any time to lose." She knew that Monticlin had spoken out, and she had hoped for a wordy interview, a stormy scene, in which she might have held her own as she had held it for the past 3 days against her family. With Monticlin's aid. But she had no weapon with which to combat subtlety. Her husband's looks, his tones, his mere presence, brought to her a sudden sense of hopelessness, an instinctive realization of the futility of rebellion against a social and sacred institution. Cazaux said nothing further, but stood waiting in the doorway. Madame Michi had walked to the far end of the gallery, and pretended to be occupied with having a chicken driven from her parterre. Monticlin stood by, exasperated, fuming, ready to burst out. Athénaïse went and reached for her riding skirt that hung against the wall. She was rather tall, with a figure which, though not robust, seemed perfect in its fine proportions. La fille de son père, she was often called, which was a great compliment to Michi. Her brown hair was brushed all fluffily back from her temples and low forehead, and about her features and expression lurked a softness, a prettiness, a dewiness, that were perhaps too childlike. That savored of immaturity. She slipped the riding skirt, which was of black alpaca, over her head, and with impatient fingers hooked it at the waist over her pink linen lawn. Then she fastened on her white sunbonnet and reached for her gloves on the mantelpiece. "If you don't want to go, you know what you got to do, the naze," fumed Monticlin. "You don't set yo' feet back on Cane River, by God, unless you want to, not while I'm alive." Cazaux looked at him as if he were a monkey whose antics fell short of being amusing. Athénaïse still made no reply, said not a word. She walked rapidly past her husband, past her brother, bidding goodbye to no one, not even to her mother. She descended the stairs, and without assistance from anyone mounted the pony, which Cazaux had ordered to be saddled upon his arrival. In this way she obtained a fair start of her husband, whose departure was far more leisurely, and for the greater part of the way she managed to keep an appreciable gap between them. She rode almost madly at first, with the wind inflating her skirt balloon-like about her knees, and her sunbonnet falling back between her shoulders. At no time did Cazaux make an effort to overtake her until traversing an old fallow meadow that was level and hard as a table. The sight of a great solitary oak tree, with its seemingly immutable outlines, that had been a landmark for ages, or was it the odor of elderberry stealing up from the gully to the south? Or what was it that brought vividly back to Cazaux, by some association of ideas, a scene of many years ago? He had passed that old live oak hundreds of times, but it was only now that the memory of one day came back to him. He was a very small boy that day, seated before his father on horseback. They were proceeding slowly, and Black Gabe was moving on before them at a little dog-trot. Black Gabe had run away, and had been discovered back in the Gotrain swamp. They had halted beneath this big oak to enable the Negro to take breath. For Cazaux's father was a kind and considerate master, and everyone had agreed at the time that Black Gabe was a fool, a great idiot indeed, for wanting to run away from him. The whole impression was for some reason hideous, and to dispel it Cazaux spurred his horse to a swift gallop. Overtaking his wife, he rode the remainder of the way at her side in silence. It was late when they reached home. Félicité was standing on the grassy edge of the road, in the moonlight, waiting for them. Cazaux once more ate his supper alone. For Athénaïse went to her room, and there she was crying again. Chapter 3. Athénaïse was not one to accept the inevitable with patient resignation, a talent born in the souls of many women. Neither was she the one to accept it with philosophical resignation, like her husband. Her sensibilities were alive and keen and responsive. She met the pleasurable things of life with frank, open appreciation, and against distasteful conditions she rebelled. Dissimulation was as foreign to her nature as guile to the breast of a babe, and her rebellious outbreaks, by no means rare, had hitherto been quite open and aboveboard. People often said that Athénaïse would know her own mind some day, which was equivalent to saying that she was at present unacquainted with it. If she ever came to such knowledge, it would be by no intellectual research, by no subtle analyses or tracing the motives of actions to their source. It would come to her as the song to the bird, the perfume and color to the flower. Her parents had hoped, not without reason and justice, that marriage would bring the poise, the desirable pose, so glaringly lacking in Athénaïse's character. Marriage they knew to be a wonderful and powerful agent in the development and formation of a woman's character, they had seen its effect too often to doubt it. And if this marriage does nothing else, exclaimed Michi in an outburst of sudden exasperation, it will rid us of Athénaïse, for I am at the end of my patience with her. You have never had the firmness to manage her, he was speaking to his wife, I have not had the time, the leisure, to devote to her training. And what good we might have accomplished, that Maud Monticlin, well, Cazot is the one. It takes just such a steady hand to guide a disposition like Athénaïse, a master hand, a strong will that compels obedience. And now, when they had hoped for so much, here was Athénaïse, with gathered and fierce vehemence, beside which her former outbursts appeared mild, declaring that she would not, and she would not. And she would not continue to enact the role of wife to Cazot. If she had had a reason. As Madame Michi lamented, but it could not be discovered that she had any sane one. He had never scolded, or called names, or deprived her of comforts, or been guilty of any of the many reprehensible acts commonly attributed to objectionable husbands. He did not slight nor neglect her. Indeed, Cazot's chief offense seemed to be that he loved her, and Athénaïse was not the woman to be loved against her will. She called marriage a trap set for the feet of unwary and unsuspecting girls, and in round, unmeasured terms reproached her mother with treachery and deceit. I told you Cazot was the man, chuckled Michi, when his wife had related the scene that had accompanied and influenced Athénaïse's departure. Athénaïse again hoped, in the morning, that Cazot would scold or make some sort of a scene, but he apparently did not dream of it. It was exasperating that he should take her acquiescence so for granted. It is true he had been up and over the fields and across the river and back long before she was out of bed, and he may have been thinking of something else, which was no excuse. Which was even in some sense an aggravation. But he did say to her at breakfast, that brother of yours, that Monticlin, is unbearable. Monticlin? Par exemple. Athénaïse, seated opposite to her husband, was attired in a white morning wrapper. She wore a somewhat abused, long face. It is true, an expression of countenance familiar to some husbands, but the expression was not sufficiently pronounced to mar the charm of her youthful freshness. She had little heart to eat, only playing with the food before her, and she felt a pang of resentment at her husband's healthy appetite. Yes, Monticlin, he reasserted. He's developed into a first-class nuisance, and you better tell him, Athénaïse, unless you want me to tell him, to confine his energies after this to matters that concern him. I have no use for him or for his interference in what regards you and me alone. This was said with unusual asperity. It was the little breach that Athénaïse had been watching for, and she charged rapidly, it's strange, if you debts Monticlin so heartily, that you would desire to marry his sister. She knew it was a silly thing to say, and was not surprised when he told her so. It gave her a little foothold for further attack, however. I don't see, anyhow, what reason you had to marry me, when there were so many others, she complained, as if accusing him of persecution and injury. There was Marianne running after you for the last 5 years till it was disgraceful, and any one of the Dortrand girls would have been glad to marry you. But no, nothing would do. You muse come out on the rigolette for me. Her complaint was pathetic, and at the same time so amusing that Cazot was forced to smile. I can't see what the Dortrand girls or Marianne have to do with it, he rejoined, adding, with no trace of amusement, I married you because I loved you. Because you were the woman I wanted to marry, and the only one. I reckon I told you that before. I thought Of course I was a fool fo, taking things fo, granted, but I did think that I might make you happy in making things easier and comfortable fo you. I expected, I was even that big a fool, I believed that coming year to me would be like the sun shining out of the clouds. And that our days would be like at the storybook's promise after the wedding. I was mistaken. But I can't imagine at induced you to marry me. Whatever it was, I reckon you found out you made a mistake, too. I don't see anything to do but make the best of a bad bargain, and shake hands over it. He had arisen from the table, and, approaching, held out his hand to her. What he had said was commonplace enough, but it was significant, coming from Cazot, who was not often so unreserved in expressing himself. Athénaïse ignored the hand held out to her. She was resting her chin in her palm, and kept her eyes fixed moodily upon the table. He rested his hand, that she would not touch, upon her head for an instant, and walked away out of the room. She heard him giving orders to workmen who had been waiting for him out on the gallery, and she heard him mount his horse and ride away. 100 things would distract him and engage his attention during the day. She felt that he had perhaps put her and her grievance from his thoughts when he crossed the threshold. Whilst old Félicite was standing there holding a shining tin pail, asking for flour and lard and eggs from the storeroom, and meal for the chicks. Athénaïse seized the bunch of keys which hung from her belt and flung them at Félicite's feet. Tiens. Tu vas les garder comme tu as Jodi's fate. Je ne veux plus de ce train là, moi. The old woman stooped and picked up the keys from the floor. It was really all one to her that her mistress returned them to her keeping, and refused to take further account of the ménage. Chapter 4. It seemed now to Athénaïse that Monticlin was the only friend left to her in the world. Her father and mother had turned from her in what appeared to be her hour of need. Her friends laughed at her, and refused to take seriously the hints which she threw out, feeling her way to discover if marriage were as distasteful to other women as to herself. Monticlin alone understood her. He alone had always been ready to act for her and with her, to comfort and solace her with his sympathy and his support. Her only hope for rescue from her hateful surroundings lay in Monticlin. Of herself she felt powerless to plan, to act, even to conceive a way out of this pitfall into which the whole world seemed to have conspired to thrust her. She had a great desire to see her brother, and wrote asking him to come to her. But it better suited Monticlin's spirit of adventure to appoint a meeting place at the turn of the lane, where Athénaïse might appear to be walking leisurely for health and recreation. And where he might seem to be riding along, bent on some errand of business or pleasure. There had been a shower, a sudden downpour, short as it was sudden, that had laid the dust in the road. It had freshened the pointed leaves of the live oaks, and brightened up the big fields of cotton on either side of the lane till they seemed carpeted with green, glittering gems. Athénaïse walked along the grassy edge of the road, lifting her crisp skirts with one hand, and with the other twirling a gay sunshade over her bare head. The scent of the fields after the rain was delicious. She inhaled long breaths of their freshness and perfume, that soothed and quieted her for the moment. There were birds splashing and spluttering in the pools, pluming themselves on the fence rails, and sending out little sharp cries, twitters, and shrill rhapsodies of delight. She saw Monticlin approaching from a great distance, almost as far away as the turn of the woods. But she could not feel sure it was he. It appeared too tall for Monticlin, but that was because he was riding a large horse. She waved her parasol to him, she was so glad to see him. She had never been so glad to see Monticlin before. Not even the day when he had taken her out of the convent, against her parents' wishes, because she had expressed a desire to remain there no longer. He seemed to her, as he drew near, the embodiment of kindness, of bravery, of chivalry, even of wisdom, for she had never known Monticlin at a loss to extricate himself from a disagreeable situation. He dismounted, and, leading his horse by the bridle, started to walk beside her, after he had kissed her affectionately and asked her what she was crying about. She protested that she was not crying, for she was laughing, though drying her eyes at the same time on her handkerchief, rolled in a soft mop for the purpose. She took Monticlin's arm, and they strolled slowly down the lane. They could not seat themselves for a comfortable chat, as they would have liked, with the grass all sparkling and bristling wet. Yes, she was quite as wretched as ever, she told him. The week which had gone by since she saw him had in no wise lightened the burden of her discontent. There had even been some additional provocations laid upon her, and she told Monticlin all about them, about the keys, for instance, which in a fit of temper she had returned to Félicite's keeping. And she told how Cazot had brought them back to her as if they were something she had accidentally lost, and he had recovered. And how he had said, in that aggravating tone of his, that it was not the custom on Cane River for the Negro servants to carry the keys, when there was a mistress at the head of the household. But Athénaïse could not tell Monticlin anything to increase the disrespect which he already entertained for his brother-in-law. And it was then he unfolded to her a plan which he had conceived and worked out for her deliverance from this galling matrimonial yoke. It was not a plan which met with instant favor, which, she was at once ready to accept, for it involved secrecy and dissimulation, hateful alternatives, both of them. But she was filled with admiration for Monticlin's resources and wonderful talent for contrivance. She accepted the plan. Not with the immediate determination to act upon it, rather with the intention to sleep and to dream upon it. 3 days later she wrote to Monticlin that she had abandoned herself to his counsel. Displeasing as it might be to her sense of honesty, it would yet be less trying than to live on with a soul full of bitterness and revolt, as she had done for the past 2 months. Chapter 5. When Cazot awoke, one morning at his usual very early hour, it was to find the place at his side vacant. This did not surprise him until he discovered that Athénaïse was not in the adjoining room, where he had often found her sleeping in the morning on the lounge. She had perhaps gone out for an early stroll, he reflected, for her jacket and hat were not on the rack where she had hung them the night before. But there were other things absent, a gown or two from the armoire, and there was a great gap in the piles of lingerie on the shelf. And her traveling bag was missing, and so were her bits of jewelry from the toilet tray, and Athénaïse was gone. But the absurdity of going during the night, as if she had been a prisoner, and he the keeper of a dungeon. So much secrecy and mystery, to go sojourning out on the Bon Dieu? Well, the Michis might keep their daughter after this. For the companionship of no woman on earth would he again undergo the humiliating sensation of baseness that had overtaken him in passing the old oak tree in the fallow meadow. But a terrible sense of loss overwhelmed Cazot. It was not new or sudden, he had felt it for weeks growing upon him, and it seemed to culminate with Athénaïse's flight from home. He knew that he could again compel her return as he had done once before, compel her to return to the shelter of his roof. Compel her cold and unwilling submission to his love and passionate transports. But the loss of self-respect seemed to him too dear a price to pay for a wife. He could not comprehend why she had seemed to prefer him above others. Why she had attracted him with eyes, with voice, with 100 womanly ways, and finally distracted him with love which she seemed, in her timid, maidenly fashion, to return. The great sense of loss came from the realization of having missed a chance for happiness, a chance that would come his way again only through a miracle. He could not think of himself loving any other woman, and could not think of Athénaïse ever, even at some remote date, caring for him. He wrote her a letter, in which he disclaimed any further intention of forcing his commands upon her. He did not desire her presence ever again in his home unless she came of her free will, uninfluenced by family or friends. Unless she could be the companion he had hoped for in marrying her, and in some measure return affection and respect for the love which he continued and would always continue to feel for her. This letter he sent out to the Rigolette by a messenger early in the day. But she was not out on the Rigolette, and had not been there. The family turned instinctively to Monticlin, and almost literally fell upon him for an explanation. He had been absent from home all night. There was much mystification in his answers, and a plain desire to mislead in his assurances of ignorance and innocence. But with Cazot there was no doubt or speculation when he accosted the young fellow. Monteclin, what have you done with Athénaïse? He questioned bluntly. They had met in the open road on horseback, just as Cazot ascended the river bank before his house. What have you done to Athénaïse? Returned Monteclin for answer. I don't reckon you've considered yo conduct by any light of decency and propriety in encouraging yo sister to such an action, but let me tell you. Voyons. You can let me alone with yo decency and morality and fiddlesticks. I know you muse, done Athénaïse pretty mean that she can't live with you. And for my part, I'm mighty dern glad she had the spirit to quit you. I ain't in the humor to take any notice of yo impertinence, Monteclin. But let me remind you that Athénaïse is nothing but a chilly in character, besides that, she's my wife, and I hold you responsible for her safety and welfare. If any harm of any description happens to her, I'll strangle you, by God, like a rat, and fling you in Cane River, if I have to hang for it. He had not lifted his voice. The only sign of anger was a savage gleam in his eyes. I reckon you better keep yo big talk for the women, Cazot, replied Monteclin, riding away. But he went doubly armed after that, and intimated that the precaution was not needless, in view of the threats and menaces that were abroad touching his personal safety. Chapter 6. Athénaïse reached her destination sound of skin and limb, but a good deal flustered, a little frightened, and altogether excited and interested by her unusual experiences. Her destination was the house of Sylvie, on Dauphine Street, in New Orleans, a 3-story gray brick, standing directly on the banquette, with 3 broad stone steps leading to the deep front entrance. From the 2nd-story balcony swung a small sign, conveying to passers-by the intelligence that within were chambers garnis. It was one morning in the last week of April that Athénaïse presented herself at the Dauphine Street house. Sylvie was expecting her, and introduced her at once to her apartment, which was in the 2nd story of the back L, and accessible by an open, outside gallery. There was a yard below, paved with broad stone flagging. Many fragrant flowering shrubs and plants grew in a bed along the side of the opposite wall, and others were distributed about in tubs and green boxes. It was a plain but large enough room into which Athénaïse was ushered, with matting on the floor, green shades and Nottingham lace curtains at the windows that looked out on the gallery, and furnished with a cheap walnut suit. But everything looked exquisitely clean, and the whole place smelled of cleanliness. Athénaïse at once fell into the rocking chair, with the air of exhaustion and intense relief of one who has come to the end of her troubles. Sylvie, entering behind her, laid the big traveling bag on the floor and deposited the jacket on the bed. She was a portly quadroon of 50 or thereabout, clad in an ample volante of the old-fashioned purple calico so much affected by her class. She wore large golden hoop earrings, and her hair was combed plainly, with every appearance of effort to smooth out the kinks. She had broad, coarse features, with a nose that turned up, exposing the wide nostrils. And that seemed to emphasize the loftiness and command of her bearing, a dignity that in the presence of white people assumed a character of respectfulness, but never of obsequiousness. Sylvie believed firmly in maintaining the color line, and would not suffer a white person, even a child, to call her Madame Sylvie, a title which she exacted religiously, however, from those of her own race. I hope you be pleased wid yo room, madam, she observed amiably. Dat's de same room at yo, brother, Monsieur Michi, all time like when he come to New Orleans. He well, Monsieur Michi. I receive his letter last week, and dat same day a gentman want I give him dat room. I say, no, dat room already engaged. Everybody like dat room on count it so quite quiet. Monsieur Gouverneur, dear in Nack's room, you can't pay him. He been stay teary year in dat room, but all fix up fine wid his own furniture and books, tell you can't see. I say to him plenty time, Monsieur Gouverneur, why you don't take dat teary story front, now, long it's empty? He tells me, leave me alone, Sylvie, I know a good room when I find it, me. She had been moving slowly and majestically about the apartment, straightening and smoothing down bed and pillows, peering into ewer and basin. Evidently casting an eye around to make sure that everything was as it should be. "I send you some fresh water, madam," she offered upon retiring from the room. "And when you want anting, you just go out on de gallery and call Pusette, she hear you plain, she right down dear in de kitchen." Athénaïse was really not so exhausted as she had every reason to be after that interminable and circuitous way by which Montalcin had seen fit to have her conveyed to the city. Would she ever forget that dark and truly dangerous midnight ride along the coast to the mouth of Cane River? There Montalcin had parted with her, after seeing her aboard the St. Louis and Shreveport packet which he knew would pass there before dawn. She had received instructions to disembark at the mouth of Red River, and their transfer to the first southbound steamer for New Orleans. All of which instructions she had followed implicitly, even to making her way at once to Sylvie's upon her arrival in the city. Montalcin had enjoined secrecy and much caution. The clandestine nature of the affair gave it a savor of adventure which was highly pleasing to him. Eloping with his sister was only a little less engaging than eloping with someone else's sister. But Montalcin did not do the grand seigneur by halves. He had paid Sylvie a whole month in advance for Athénaïse's board and lodging. Part of the sum he had been forced to borrow, it is true, but he was not niggardly. Athénaïse was to take her meals in the house, which none of the other lodgers did. The one exception being that Mr. Gouvernail was served with breakfast on Sunday mornings. Sylvie's clientele came chiefly from the southern parishes. For the most part, people spending but a few days in the city. She prided herself upon the quality and highly respectable character of her patrons, who came and went unobtrusively. The large parlor opening upon the front balcony was seldom used. Her guests were permitted to entertain in this sanctuary of elegance, but they never did. She often rented it for the night to parties of respectable and discreet gentlemen desiring to enjoy a quiet game of cards outside the bosom of their families. The second-story hall also led by a long window out on the balcony. And Sylvie advised Athénaïse, when she grew weary of her back room, to go and sit on the front balcony, which was shady in the afternoon, and where she might find diversion in the sounds and sights of the street below. Athénaïse refreshed herself with a bath, and was soon unpacking her few belongings, which she ranged neatly away in the bureau drawers and the armoire. She had revolved certain plans in her mind during the past hour or so. Her present intention was to live on indefinitely in this big, cool, clean back room on Dauphine Street. She had thought seriously, for moments, of the convent, with all readiness to embrace the vows of poverty and chastity, but what about obedience? Later, she intended, in some roundabout way, to give her parents and her husband the assurance of her safety and welfare, reserving the right to remain unmolested and lost to them. To live on at the expense of Montalcin's generosity was wholly out of the question, and Athénaïse meant to look about for some suitable and agreeable employment. The imperative thing to be done at present, however, was to go out in search of material for an inexpensive gown or two. For she found herself in the painful predicament of a young woman having almost literally nothing to wear. She decided upon pure white for one, and some sort of a sprigged muslin for the other. Chapter 7. On Sunday morning, 2 days after Athénaïse's arrival in the city, she went in to breakfast somewhat later than usual. To find 2 covers laid at table instead of the one to which she was accustomed. She had been to Mass, and did not remove her hat, but put her fan, parasol, and prayer book aside. The dining room was situated just beneath her own apartment, and, like all rooms of the house, was large and airy. The floor was covered with a glistening oilcloth. The small, round table, immaculately set, was drawn near the open window. There were some tall plants in boxes on the gallery outside. And Pusette, a little, old, intensely black woman, was splashing and dashing buckets of water on the flagging, and talking loud in her Creole patois to no one in particular. A dish piled with delicate river shrimps and crushed ice was on the table. A carafe of crystal-clear water, a a few hors d'oeuvres, beside a small golden-brown crusty loaf of French bread at each plate. A half-bottle of wine and the morning paper were set at the place opposite Athénaïse. She had almost completed her breakfast when Gouvernail came in and seated himself at table. He felt annoyed at finding his cherished privacy invaded. Sylvie was removing the remains of a mutton chop from before Athénaïse, and serving her with a cup of café au lait. Monsieur Gouvernail, offered Sylvie in her most insinuating and impressive manner, you please leave me make you acquaint wid Madame Cazot. Dat's Monsieur Michiel's sister. You meet im two tieri time, you reckelle ici, and been one day to de race wid im. Madame Cazot, you please leave me make you acquaint wid Monsieur Gouvernail. Gouvernail expressed himself greatly pleased to meet the sister of Monsieur Michi, of whom he had not the slightest recollection. He inquired after Monsieur Michiel's health, and politely offered Athénaïse a part of his newspaper, the part which contained the woman's page and the social gossip. Athénaïse faintly remembered that Sylvie had spoken of a Monsieur Gouvernail occupying the room adjoining hers, living amid luxurious surroundings and a multitude of books. She had not thought of him further than to picture him a stout, middle-aged gentleman, with a bushy beard turning grey, wearing large gold-rimmed spectacles, and stooping somewhat from much bending over books and writing material. She had confused him in her mind with the likeness of some literary celebrity that she had run across in the advertising pages of a magazine. Gouvernail's appearance was, in truth, in no sense striking. He looked older than 30 and younger than 40, was of medium height and weight, with a quiet, unobtrusive manner which seemed to ask that he be let alone. His hair was light brown, brushed carefully and parted in the middle. His mustache was brown, and so were his eyes, which had a mild, penetrating quality. He was neatly dressed in the fashion of the day, and his hands seemed to Athénaïse remarkably white and soft for a man's. He had been buried in the contents of his newspaper, when he suddenly realized that some further little attention might be due to Michiel's sister. He started to offer her a glass of wine, when he was surprised and relieved to find that she had quietly slipped away while he was absorbed in his own editorial on corrupt legislation. Gouvernail finished his paper and smoked his cigar out on the gallery. He lounged about, gathered a rose for his buttonhole, and had his regular Sunday morning confab with Pusette, to whom he paid a weekly stipend for brushing his shoes and clothing. He made a great pretense of haggling over the transaction, only to enjoy her uneasiness and garrulous excitement. He worked or read in his room for a few hours, and when he quitted the house, at 3 in the afternoon, it was to return no more till late at night. It was his almost invariable custom to spend Sunday evenings out in the American quarter, among a congenial set of men and women, d'esprits forts, all of them, whose lives were irreproachable, yet whose opinions would startle even the traditional sapeur, for whom nothing is sacred. But for all his advanced opinions, Gouvernail was a liberal-minded fellow. A man or woman lost nothing of his respect by being married. When he left the house in the afternoon, Athénaïse had already ensconced herself on the front balcony. He could see her through the jalousies when he passed on his way to the front entrance. She had not yet grown lonesome or homesick, the newness of her surroundings made them sufficiently entertaining. She found it diverting to sit there on the front balcony watching people pass by, even though there was no one to talk to. And then the comfortable sense of not being married. She watched Gouvernail walk down the street, and could find no fault with his bearing. He could hear the sound of her rockers for some little distance. He wondered what the poor little thing was doing in the city, and meant to ask Sylvie about her when he should happen to think of it. Chapter 8. The following morning, towards noon, when Gouvernail quitted his room, he was confronted by Athénaïse. Exhibiting some confusion and trepidation at being forced to request a favor of him at so early a stage of their acquaintance. She stood in her doorway, and had evidently been sewing, as the thimble on her finger testified, as well as a long-threaded needle thrust in the bosom of her gown. She held a stamped but unaddressed letter in her hand. And would Mr. Gouvernail be so kind as to address the letter to her brother, Mr. Monteclin Michi? She would hate to detain him with explanations this morning, another time, perhaps, but now she begged that he would give himself the trouble. He assured her that it made no difference, that it was no trouble whatever. And he drew a fountain pen from his pocket and addressed the letter at her dictation, resting it on the inverted rim of his straw hat. She wondered a little at a man of his supposed erudition stumbling over the spelling of a Monticlin and Michi. She demurred at overwhelming him with the additional trouble of posting it. But he succeeded in convincing her that so simple a task as the posting of a letter would not add an iota to the burden of the day. Moreover, he promised to carry it in his hand, and thus avoid any possible risk of forgetting it in his pocket. After that, and after a second repetition of the favor, when she had told him that she had had a letter from Monticlin, and looked as if she wanted to tell him more, he felt that he knew her better. He felt that he knew her well enough to join her out on the balcony, one night, when he found her sitting there alone. He was not one who deliberately sought the society of women, but he was not wholly a bear. A little commiseration for Athénaïse's aloneness, perhaps some curiosity to know further what manner of woman she was, and the natural influence of her feminine charm were equal unconfessed factors in turning his steps towards the balcony when he discovered the shimmer of her white gown through the open hall window. It was already quite late, but the day had been intensely hot, and neighboring balconies and doorways were occupied by chattering groups of humanity, loath to abandon the grateful freshness of the outer air. The voices about her served to reveal to Athénaïse the feeling of loneliness that was gradually coming over her. Notwithstanding certain dormant impulses, she craved human sympathy and companionship. She shook hands impulsively with Gouvernail, and told him how glad she was to see him. He was not prepared for such an admission, but it pleased him immensely, detecting as he did that the expression was as sincere as it was outspoken. He drew a chair up within comfortable conversational distance of Athénaïse. Though he had no intention of talking more than was barely necessary to encourage Madame, he had actually forgotten her name. He leaned an elbow on the balcony rail, and would have offered an opening remark about the oppressive heat of the day, but Athénaïse did not give him the opportunity. How glad she was to talk to someone, and how she talked. An hour later she had gone to her room, and Gouvernail stayed smoking on the balcony. He knew her quite well after that hour's talk. It was not so much what she had said as what her half-saying had revealed to his quick intelligence. He knew that she adored Monticlin, and he suspected that she adored Cazot without being herself aware of it. He had gathered that she was self-willed, impulsive, innocent, ignorant, unsatisfied, dissatisfied. For had she not complained that things seemed all wrongly arranged in this world, and no one was permitted to be happy in his own way? And he told her he was sorry she had discovered that primordial fact of existence so early in life. He commiserated her loneliness, and scanned his bookshelves next morning for something to lend her to read, rejecting everything that offered itself to his view. Philosophy was out of the question, and so was poetry, that is, such poetry as he possessed. He had not sounded her literary tastes, and strongly suspected she had none. That she would have rejected the Duchess as readily as Mrs. Humphrey Ward. He compromised on a magazine. It had entertained her passably, she admitted, upon returning it. A New England story had puzzled her, it was true, and a Creole tale had offended her, but the pictures had pleased her greatly. Especially one which had reminded her so strongly of Monticlin after a hard day's ride that she was loath to give it up. It was one of Remington's cowboys, and Gouvernail insisted upon her keeping it, keeping the magazine. He spoke to her daily after that, and was always eager to render her some service or to do something towards her entertainment. One afternoon he took her out to the lake end. She had been there once, some years before, but in winter, so the trip was comparatively new and strange to her. The large expanse of water studded with pleasure boats, the sight of children playing merrily along the grassy palisades, the music, all enchanted her. Gouvernail thought her the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Even her gown, the sprigged muslin, appeared to him the most charming one imaginable. Nor could anything be more becoming than the arrangement of her brown hair under the white sailor hat, all rolled back in a soft puff from her radiant face. And she carried her parasol and lifted her skirts and used her fan in ways that seemed quite unique and peculiar to herself, and which he considered almost worthy of study and imitation. They did not dine out there at the water's edge, as they might have done, but returned early to the city to avoid the crowd. Athénaïse wanted to go home, for she said Sylvie would have dinner prepared and would be expecting her. But it was not difficult to persuade her to dine instead in the quiet little restaurant that he knew and liked, with its sanded floor, its secluded atmosphere, its delicious menu, and its obsequious waiter wanting to know what he might have the honor of serving to Monsieur et Madame. No wonder he made the mistake, with Gouvernail assuming such an air of proprietorship. But Athénaïse was very tired after it all. The sparkle went out of her face, and she hung draggingly on his arm in walking home. He was reluctant to part from her when she bade him good night at her door and thanked him for the agreeable evening. He had hoped she would sit outside until it was time for him to regain the newspaper office. He knew that she would undress and get into her peignoir and lie upon her bed. And what he wanted to do, what he would have given much to do, was to go and sit beside her, read to her something restful, soothe her, do her bidding, whatever it might be. Of course there was no use in thinking of that. But he was surprised at his growing desire to be serving her. She gave him an opportunity sooner than he looked for. "Mr. Gouvernail," she called from her room, "will you be so kind as to call Posette and tell her she forgot to bring my ice water?" He was indignant at Posette's negligence, and called severely to her over the banisters. He was sitting before his own door, smoking. He knew that Athénaïse had gone to bed, for her room was dark, and she had opened the slats of the door and windows. Her bed was near a window. Posette came flopping up with the ice water, and with 100 excuses, "Mo pas oua vous à table cte l'anuit, mo cri vous pay gagni déjà là-bas, parole. Vous pas cri conti ca Madame Sylvie?" She had not seen Athénaïse at table, and thought she was gone. She swore to this, and hoped Madame Sylvie would not be informed of her remissness. A little later Athénaïse lifted her voice again. "Mr. Gouvernail, did you remark that young man sitting on the opposite side from us, coming in, with a grey coat and a blue band around his hat?" Of course Gouvernail had not noticed any such individual, but he assured Athénaïse that he had observed the young fellow particularly. "Don't you think he looked something, not very much, of Coessy, but don't you think he had a little faux air of Monticlin?" "I think he looked strikingly like Monticlin," asserted Gouvernail, with the one idea of prolonging the conversation. "I meant to call your attention to the resemblance, and something drove it out of my head." "The same with me," returned Athénaïse. "Ah, my dear Monticlin. I wonder what he is doing now." "Did you receive any news, any letter from him today?" asked Gouvernail, determined that if the conversation ceased it should not be through lack of effort on his part to sustain it. "Not today, but yesterday. He tells me that Maman was so distracted with uneasiness that finally, to pacify her, he was said to confess that he knew where I was, but that he was bound by a vow of secrecy not to reveal it. But Cazot has not noticed him or spoken to him since he threatened to throw Monticlin in Cane River. You know Cazot wrote me a letter the morning I left, thinking I had gone to the Rigolette. And Maman opened it, and said it was full of the most noble sentiments, and she wanted Monticlin to send it to me, but Monticlin refused point blank, so he wrote to me." Gouvernail preferred to talk of Monticlin. He pictured Cazot as unbearable, and did not like to think of him. A little later Athénaïse called out, "Good night, Mr. Gouvernail." "Good night," he returned reluctantly. And when he thought that she was sleeping, he got up and went away to the midnight pandemonium of his newspaper office. Chapter 9. Athénaïse could not have held out through the month had it not been for Gouvernail. With the need of caution and secrecy always uppermost in her mind, she made no new acquaintances, and she did not seek out persons already known to her. However, she knew so few, it required little effort to keep out of their way. As for Sylvie, almost every moment of her time was occupied in looking after her house. And, moreover, her deferential attitude towards her lodgers forbade anything like the gossipy chats in which Athénaïse might have condescended sometimes to indulge with her landlady. The transient lodgers, who came and went, she never had occasion to meet. Hence she was entirely dependent upon Gouvernail for company. He appreciated the situation fully. And every moment that he could spare from his work he devoted to her entertainment. She liked to be out of doors, and they strolled together in the summer twilight through the mazes of the old French quarter. They went again to the lake end, and stayed for hours on the water, returning so late that the streets through which they passed were silent and deserted. On Sunday morning he arose at an unconscionable hour to take her to the French market, knowing that the sights and sounds there would interest her. And he did not join the intellectual coterie in the afternoon, as he usually did, but placed himself all day at the disposition and service of Athénaïse. Notwithstanding all, his manner toward her was tactful, and evinced intelligence and a deep knowledge of her character, surprising upon so brief an acquaintance. For the time he was everything to her that she would have him. He replaced home and friends. Sometimes she wondered if he had ever loved a woman. She could not fancy him loving anyone passionately, rudely, offensively, as Cazot loved her. Once she was so naive as to ask him outright if he had ever been in love, and he assured her promptly that he had not. She thought it an admirable trait in his character, and esteemed him greatly therefore. He found her crying one night, not openly or violently. She was leaning over the gallery rail, watching the toads that hopped about in the moonlight, down on the damp flagstones of the courtyard. There was an oppressively sweet odor rising from the Cape jessamine. Cosette was down there, mumbling and quarreling with someone, and seeming to be having it all her own way, as well she might. When her companion was only a black cat that had come in from a neighboring yard to keep her company. Athénaïse did admit feeling heartsick, body-sick. When he questioned her, she supposed it was nothing but homesick. A letter from Monticlin had stirred her all up. She longed for her mother, for Monticlin. She was sick for a sight of the cotton fields, the scent of the ploughed earth, for the dim, mysterious charm of the woods, and the old tumble-down home on the Bon Dieu. As Gouvernail listened to her, a wave of pity and tenderness swept through him. He took her hands and pressed them against him. He wondered what would happen if he were to put his arms around her. He was hardly prepared for what happened, but he stood it courageously. She twined her arms around his neck and wept outright on his shoulder. The hot tears scalding his cheek and neck, and her whole body shaken in his arms. The impulse was powerful to strain her to him, the temptation was fierce to seek her lips, but he did neither. He understood 1,000 times better than she herself understood it that he was acting as substitute for Monticlin. Bitter as the conviction was, he accepted it. He was patient, he could wait. He hoped some day to hold her with a lover's arms. That she was married made no particle of difference to Gouvernail. He could not conceive or dream of it making a difference. When the time came that she wanted him, as he hoped and believed it would come, he felt he would have a right to her. So long as she did not want him, he had no right to her, no more than her husband had. It was very hard to feel her warm breath and tears upon his cheek, and her struggling bosom pressed against him and her soft arms clinging to him and his whole body and soul aching for her. And yet to make no sign. He tried to think what Monticlin would have said and done, and to act accordingly. He stroked her hair, and held her in a gentle embrace, until the tears dried and the sobs ended. Before releasing herself she kissed him against the neck. She had to love somebody in her own way. Even that he endured like a stoic. But it was well he left her, to plunge into the thick of rapid, breathless, exacting work till nearly dawn. Athénaïse was greatly soothed, and slept well. The touch of friendly hands and caressing arms had been very grateful. Henceforward she would not be lonely and unhappy, with Gouvernail there to comfort her. Chapter 10. The 4th week of Athénaïse's stay in the city was drawing to a close. Keeping in view the intention which she had of finding some suitable and agreeable employment, she had made a few tentatives in that direction. But with the exception of 2 little girls who had promised to take piano lessons at a price that would be embarrassing to mention, these attempts had been fruitless. Moreover, the homesickness kept coming back, and Gouvernail was not always there to drive it away. She spent much of her time weeding and pottering among the flowers down in the courtyard. She tried to take an interest in the black cat, and a mockingbird that hung in a cage outside the kitchen door, and a disreputable parrot that belonged to the cook next door. And swore hoarsely all day long in bad French. Beside, she was not well, she was not herself, as she told Sylvie. The climate of New Orleans did not agree with her. Sylvie was distressed to learn this, as she felt in some measure responsible for the health and well-being of Monsieur Michiel's sister. And she made it her duty to inquire closely into the nature and character of Athénaïse's malaise. Sylvie was very wise, and Athénaïse was very ignorant. The extent of her ignorance and the depth of her subsequent enlightenment were bewildering. She stayed a long, long time quite still, quite stunned, after her interview with Sylvie, except for the short, uneven breathing that ruffled her bosom. Her whole being was steeped in a wave of ecstasy. When she finally arose from the chair in which she had been seated, and looked at herself in the mirror, a face met hers which she seemed to see for the first time. So transfigured was it with wonder and rapture. One mood quickly followed another, in this new turmoil of her senses, and the need of action became uppermost. Her mother must know at once, and her mother must tell Monticlin. And Cazot must know. As she thought of him, the first purely sensuous tremor of her life swept over her. She half whispered his name, and the sound of it brought red blotches into her cheeks. She spoke it over and over, as if it were some new, sweet sound born out of darkness and confusion, and reaching her for the first time. She was impatient to be with him. Her whole passionate nature was aroused as if by a miracle. She seated herself to write to her husband. The letter he would get in the morning, and she would be with him at night. What would he say? How would he act? She knew that he would forgive her, for had he not written a letter, and a pang of resentment toward Monticlin shot through her. What did he mean by withholding that letter? How dared he not have sent it? Athénaïse attired herself for the street, and went out to post the letter which she had penned with a single thought, a spontaneous impulse. It would have seemed incoherent to most people, but Cazot would understand. She walked along the street as if she had fallen heir to some magnificent inheritance. On her face was a look of pride and satisfaction that passers-by noticed and admired. She wanted to talk to someone, to tell some person. And she stopped at the corner and told the oyster woman, who was Irish, and who God blessed her, and wished prosperity to the race of Cazots for generations to come. She held the oyster woman's fat, dirty little baby in her arms and scanned it curiously and observingly, as if a baby were a phenomenon that she encountered for the first time in life. She even kissed it. Then what a relief it was to Athénaïse to walk the streets without dread of being seen and recognized by some chance acquaintance from Red River. No one could have said now that she did not know her own mind. She went directly from the oyster woman's to the office of Harding and Offdean, her husband's merchants. And it was with such an air of partnership, almost proprietorship, that she demanded a sum of money on her husband's account. They gave it to her as unhesitatingly as they would have handed it over to Cazot himself. When Mr. Harding, who knew her, asked politely after her health, she turned so rosy and looked so conscious, he thought it a great pity for so pretty a woman to be such a little goose. Athénaïse entered a dry goods store and bought all manner of things, little presents for nearly everybody she knew. She bought whole bolts of sheerest, softest, downiest white stuff. And when the clerk, in trying to meet her wishes, asked if she intended it for infants' use, she could have sunk through the floor, and wondered how he might have suspected it. As it was Monticlin who had taken her away from her husband, she wanted it to be Monticlin who should take her back to him. So she wrote him a very curt note, in fact it was a postal card, asking that he meet her at the train on the evening following. She felt convinced that after what had gone before, Cazot would await her at their own home, and she preferred it so. Then there was the agreeable excitement of getting ready to leave, of packing up her things. Pusette kept coming and going, coming and going. And each time that she quitted the room it was with something that Athénaïse had given her, a handkerchief, a petticoat, a pair of stockings with 2 tiny holes at the toes, some broken pearl beads. And finally a silver dollar. Next it was Sylvie who came along bearing a gift of what she called a set of pattern, things of complicated design which never could have been obtained in any newfangled bazaar or pattern store. That Sylvie had acquired of a foreign lady of distinction whom she had nursed years before at the St. Charles Hotel. Athénaïse accepted and handled them with reverence, fully sensible of the great compliment and favor, and laid them religiously away in the trunk which she had lately acquired. She was greatly fatigued after the day of unusual exertion, and went early to bed and to sleep. All day long she had not once thought of Gouvernail, and only did think of him when aroused for a brief instant by the sound of his footfalls on the gallery, as he passed in going to his room. He had hoped to find her up, waiting for him. But the next morning he knew. Someone must have told him. There was no subject known to her which Sylvie hesitated to discuss in detail with any man of suitable years and discretion. Athénaïse found Gouvernail waiting with a carriage to convey her to the railway station. A momentary pang visited her for having forgotten him so completely, when he said to her, "Sylvie tells me you are going away this morning." He was kind, attentive, and amiable, as usual, but respected to the utmost the new dignity and reserve that her manner had developed since yesterday. She kept looking from the carriage window, silent, and embarrassed as Eve after losing her ignorance. He talked of the muddy streets and the murky morning, and of Monticlin. He hoped she would find everything comfortable and pleasant in the country, and trusted she would inform him whenever she came to visit the city again. He talked as if afraid or mistrustful of silence and himself. At the station she handed him her purse, and he bought her ticket, secured for her a comfortable section, checked her trunk, and got all the bundles and things safely aboard the train. She felt very grateful. He pressed her hand warmly, lifted his hat, and left her. He was a man of intelligence, and took defeat gracefully, that was all. But as he made his way back to the carriage, he was thinking, by heaven, it hurts, it hurts. Chapter 11. Athénaïse spent a day of supreme happiness and expectancy. The fair sight of the country unfolding itself before her was balm to her vision and to her soul. She was charmed with the rather unfamiliar, broad, clean sweep of the sugar plantations, with their monster sugar houses, their rows of neat cabins like little villages of a single street, and their impressive homes standing apart amid clusters of trees. There were sudden glimpses of a bayou curling between sunny, grassy banks, or creeping sluggishly out from a tangled growth of wood, and brush, and fern, and poison vines, and palmettos. And passing through the long stretches of monotonous woodlands, she would close her eyes and taste in anticipation the moment of her meeting with Cazot. She could think of nothing but him. It was night when she reached her station. There was Monticlin, as she had expected, waiting for her with a 2-seated buggy, to which he had hitched his own swift-footed, spirited pony. It was good, he felt, to have her back on any terms, and he had no fault to find since she came of her own choice. He more than suspected the cause of her coming. Her eyes and her voice and her foolish little manner went far in revealing the secret that was brimming over in her heart. But after he had deposited her at her own gate, and as he continued his way toward the Rigolette, he could not help feeling that the affair had taken a very disappointing, an ordinary, a most commonplace turn, after all. He left her in Cazot's keeping. Her husband lifted her out of the buggy, and neither said a word until they stood together within the shelter of the gallery. Even then they did not speak at first. But Athénaïse turned to him with an appealing gesture. As he clasped her in his arms, he felt the yielding of her whole body against him. He felt her lips for the first time respond to the passion of his own. The country night was dark and warm and still, save for the distant notes of an accordion which someone was playing in a cabin away off. A little Negro baby was crying somewhere. As Athénaïse withdrew from her husband's embrace, the sound arrested her. "Listen, Cazot. How Juliet's baby is crying. Pauvre Ticho, I wonder what is the matter with it." A night in Acadie. There was nothing to do on the plantation, so Telesphore, having a few dollars in his pocket, thought he would go down and spend Sunday in the vicinity of Marksville. There was really nothing more to do in the vicinity of Marksville than in the neighborhood of his own small farm. But Elvina would not be down there, nor Amaranth, nor any of Mommy Walter's daughters to harass him with doubt, to torture him with indecision. To turn his very soul into a weathercock for love's fair winds to play with. Telesphore at 28 had long felt the need of a wife. His home without one was like an empty temple in which there is no altar, no offering. So keenly did he realize the necessity that a dozen times at least during the past year he had been on the point of proposing marriage to almost as many different young women of the neighborhood. Therein lay the difficulty, the trouble which Telesphore experienced in making up his mind. Elvina's eyes were beautiful and had often tempted him to the verge of a declaration. But her skin was over-swarthy for a wife, and her movements were slow and heavy. He doubted she had Indian blood, and we all know what Indian blood is for treachery. Amaranth presented in her person none of these obstacles to matrimony. If her eyes were not so handsome as Elvina's, her skin was fine, and being slender to a fault, she moved swiftly about her household affairs. Or when she walked the country lanes in going to church or to the store. Telesphore had once reached the point of believing that Amaranth would make him an excellent wife. He had even started out one day with the intention of declaring himself, when, as the god of chance would have it, Mommy Valtour espied him passing in the road and enticed him to enter and partake of coffee and bains. He would have been a man of stone to have resisted, or to have remained insensible to the charms and accomplishments of the Valtour girls. Finally there was Ganache's widow, seductive rather than handsome, with a good bit of property in her own right. While Telesphore was considering his chances of happiness or even success with Ganache's widow, she married a younger man. From these embarrassing conditions, Telesphore sometimes felt himself forced to escape, to change his environment for a day or two and thereby gain a few new insights by shifting his point of view. It was Saturday morning that he decided to spend Sunday in the vicinity of Marksville, and the same afternoon found him waiting at the country station for the southbound train. He was a robust young fellow with good, strong features and a somewhat determined expression, despite his vacillations in the choice of a wife. He was dressed rather carefully in navy blue, store clothes, that fitted well because anything would have fitted Telesphore. He had been freshly shaved and trimmed and carried an umbrella. He wore, a little tilted over one eye, a straw hat in preference to the conventional grey felt, for no other reason than that his uncle Telesphore would have worn a felt, and a battered one at that. His whole conduct of life had been planned on lines in direct contradistinction to those of his uncle Telesphore, whom he was thought in early youth to greatly resemble. The elder Telesphore could not read nor write, therefore the younger had made it the object of his existence to acquire these accomplishments. The uncle pursued the avocations of hunting, fishing and moss-picking, employments which the nephew held in detestation. And as for carrying an umbrella, nunc, Telesphore would have walked the length of the parish in a deluge before he would have so much as thought of one. In short, Telesphore, by advisedly shaping his course in direct opposition to that of his uncle, managed to lead a rather orderly, industrious, and respectable existence. It was a little warm for April, but the car was not uncomfortably crowded and Telesphore was fortunate enough to secure the last available window seat on the shady side. He was not too familiar with railway travel, his expeditions being usually made on horseback or in a buggy, and the short trip promised to interest him. There was no one present whom he knew well enough to speak to, the district attorney, whom he knew by sight, a French priest from Natchitoches and a few faces that were familiar only because they were native. But he did not greatly care to speak to anyone. There was a fair stand of cotton and corn in the fields and Telesphore gathered satisfaction in silent contemplation of the crops, comparing them with his own. It was toward the close of his journey that a young girl boarded the train. There had been girls getting on and off at intervals, and it was perhaps because of the bustle attending her arrival that this one attracted Telesphor's attention. She called goodbye to her father from the platform and waved goodbye to him through the dusty, sunlit window pane after entering, for she was compelled to seat herself on the sunny side. She seemed inwardly excited and preoccupied save for the attention which she lavished upon a large parcel that she carried religiously and laid reverentially down upon the seat before her. She was neither tall nor short, nor stout nor slender, nor was she beautiful, nor was she plain. She wore a figured lawn, cut a little low in the back, that exposed a round, soft nuke with a few little clinging circlets of soft, brown hair. Her hat was of white straw, cocked up on the side with a bunch of pansies, and she wore grey lisle thread gloves. The girl seemed very warm and kept mopping her face. She vainly sought her fan, then she fanned herself with her handkerchief, and finally made an attempt to open the window. She might as well have tried to move the banks of Red River. Telesphore had been unconsciously watching her the whole time, and perceiving her straight he arose and went to her assistance. But the window could not be opened. When he had grown red in the face and wasted an amount of energy that would have driven the plough for a day, he offered her his seat on the shady side. She demurred. There would be no room for the bundle. He suggested that the bundle be left where it was and agreed to assist her in keeping an eye upon it. She accepted Telesphore's place at the shady window and he seated himself beside her. He wondered if she would speak to him. He feared she might have mistaken him for a Western drummer, in which event he knew that she would not. For the women of the country caution their daughters against speaking to strangers on the trains. But the girl was not one to mistake an Acadian farmer for a Western traveling man. She was not born in Avoyelles parish for nothing. "I wouldn't want anything to happen to it," she said. "It's all right where it is," he assured her, following the direction of her glance, that was fastened upon the bundle. "The last time I came over to Fauches ball I got caught in the rain on my way up to my cousin's house, and my dress. Je vous réponds. It was a sight. L'Iloimo, I would miss the ball. As it was, the dress looked like Idwa, it weeks without doing up." "No fear of rain today," he reassured her, glancing out at the sky, "but you can have my umbrella if it does rain. You just as well take it as not." "Oh, no. I wrap the dress roon in toile cirée this time. You goin' to Fauches ball? Didn't I meet you once yonda on Bayou Durban? Looks like I know yo face. You muse comme fom Nakatesh Paish. My cousins, the Fido family, live yonda. Me, I live on my own place in Rapides since '92. He wondered if she would follow up her inquiry relative to Fauches ball. If she did, he was ready with an answer, for he had decided to go to the ball. But her thoughts evidently wandered from the subject and were occupied with matters that did not concern him, for she turned away and gazed silently out of the window. It was not a village. It was not even a hamlet at which they descended. The station was set down upon the edge of a cotton field. Near at hand was the post office and store. There was a section house. There were a few cabins at wide intervals, and one in the distance the girl informed him was the home of her cousin, Jules Troudon. There lay a good bit of road before them and she did not hesitate to accept Telesphore's offer to bear her bundle on the way. She carried herself boldly and stepped out freely and easily, like a negress. There was an absence of reserve in her manner, yet there was no lack of womanliness. She had the air of a young person accustomed to decide for herself and for those about her. "You said yo name was Fido?" she asked, looking squarely at Telesphore. Her eyes were penetrating, not sharply penetrating, but earnest and dark, and a little searching. He noticed that they were handsome eyes, not so large as Elvina's, but finer in their expression. They started to walk down the track before turning into the lane leading to Troudon's house. The sun was sinking and the air was fresh and invigorating by contrast with the stifling atmosphere of the train. "You said yo name was Fido?" she asked. "No," he returned. "My name is Telesphore Baquet." And my name, it's Zaida Trodan. It looks like you ought to know me, I don't know why. It looks that way to me, somehow, he replied. They were satisfied to recognize this feeling, almost conviction, of pre-acquaintance, without trying to penetrate its cause. By the time they reached Trodan's house he knew that she lived over on Bayou de Glaise with her parents and a number of younger brothers and sisters. It was rather dull where they lived and she often came to lend a hand when her cousin's wife got tangled in domestic complications. Or, as she was doing now, when Foch's Saturday ball promised to be unusually important and brilliant. There would be people there even from Marksville, she thought. There were often gentlemen from Alexandria. Telesphore was as unreserved as she, and they appeared like old acquaintances when they reached Trodan's gate. Trodan's wife was standing on the gallery with a baby in her arms, watching for Zaida, and 4 little barefooted children were sitting in a row on the step, also waiting. But terrified and struck motionless and dumb at sight of a stranger. He opened the gate for the girl but stayed outside himself. Zaida presented him formally to her cousin's wife, who insisted upon his entering. Ah, bien, pour ca. You got to come in. It's any sense you goin' to walk yonda to Foch's. T. Jules, run call yo, pa. As if T. Jules could have run or walked even, or moved a muscle. But Telesphore was firm. He drew forth his silver watch and looked at it in a businesslike fashion. He always carried a watch, his uncle Telesphore always told the time by the sun, or by instinct, like an animal. He was quite determined to walk on to Foch's, a couple of miles away, where he expected to secure supper and a lodging, as well as the pleasing distraction of the ball. Well, I reckon I see you all tonight, he uttered in cheerful anticipation as he moved away. You'll see Zaida, yes, and Jules, called out Trodan's wife good-humoredly. Me, I got no time to fool with balls, je vous réponds. With all them children. He's good-lookin', yes, she exclaimed, when Telesphore was out of earshot. And dressed. It's like a prince. I didn't know you knew any baquettes, you, Zaida. It's strange you don't know yo sef, cousine. Well, there had been no question from Mommy Trodan, so why should there be an answer from Zaida? Telesphore wondered as he walked why he had not accepted the invitation to enter. He was not regretting it, he was simply wondering what could have induced him to decline. For it surely would have been agreeable to sit there on the gallery waiting while Zaida prepared herself for the dance. To have partaken of supper with the family and afterward accompanied them to Foch's. The whole situation was so novel, and had presented itself so unexpectedly that Telesphore wished in reality to become acquainted with it, accustomed to it. He wanted to view it from this side and that in comparison with other, familiar situations. The girl had impressed him, affected him in some way. But in some new, unusual way, not as the others always had. He could not recall details of her personality as he could recall such details of Amaranth or the Valtours, of any of them. When Telesphore tried to think of her he could not think at all. He seemed to have absorbed her in some way and his brain was not so occupied with her as his senses were. At that moment he was looking forward to the ball, there was no doubt about that. Afterwards, he did not know what he would look forward to, he did not care, afterward made no difference. If he had expected the crash of doom to come after the dance at Foch's, he would only have smiled in his thankfulness that it was not to come before. There was the same scene every Saturday at Foch's. A scene to have aroused the guardians of the peace in a locality where such commodities abound. And all on account of the mammoth pot of gumbo that bubbled out in the open air. Foch in shirt-sleeves, fat, red and enraged, swore and reviled, and stormed at old Black Dut for her extravagance. He called her every kind of a name of every kind of animal that suggested itself to his lurid imagination. And every fresh invective that he fired at her she hurled it back at him while into the pot went the chickens and the pans full of minced ham. And the fists full of onion and sage and piment rouge and piment vert. If he wanted her to cook for pigs he had only to say so. She knew how to cook for pigs and she knew how to cook for people of less of oils. The gumbo smelled good, and Telesphore would have liked a taste of it. Dut was dragging from the fire a stick of wood that Foch had officiously thrust beneath the simmering pot. And she muttered as she hurled it smoldering to one side. Vox mieux ys mêlé ces affaires, Louis. Si non. But she was all courtesy as she dipped a steaming plate for Telesphore, though she assured him it would not be fit for a Christian or a gentleman to taste till midnight. Telesphore, having brushed, spruced, and refreshed himself, strolled about, taking a view of the surroundings. The house, big, bulky and weather-beaten, consisted chiefly of galleries in every stage of decrepitude and dilapidation. There were a few chinaberry trees and a spreading live oak in the yard. Along the edge of the fence, a good distance away, was a line of gnarled and distorted mulberry trees. And it was there, out in the road, that the people who came to the ball tied their ponies, their wagons and carts. Dusk was beginning to fall and Telesphore, looking out across the prairie, could see them coming from all directions. The little Creole ponies galloping in a line looked like hobby horses in the faint distance, the mule carts were like toy wagons. Zaida might be among those people approaching, flying, crawling ahead of the darkness that was creeping out of the far wood. He hoped so, but he did not believe so. She would hardly have had time to dress. Foch was noisily lighting lamps, with the assistance of an inoffensive mulatto boy whom he intended in the morning to butcher, to cut into sections, to pack and salt down in a barrel. Like the Colfax woman did to her old husband, fitting destiny for so stupid a pig as the mulatto boy. The Negro musicians had arrived, 2 fiddlers and an accordion player, and they were drinking whiskey from a black quart bottle which was passed socially from one to the other. The musicians were really never at their best till the quart bottle had been consumed. The girls who came in wagons and on ponies from a distance wore, for the most part, calico dresses and sunbonnets. Their finery they brought along in pillow slips or pinned up in sheets and towels. With these they at once retired to an upper room, later to appear beribboned and befurbelowed, their faces masked with starch powder, but never a touch of rouge. Most of the guests had assembled when Zaida arrived, dashed up, would better express her coming, in an open, 2-seated buckboard, with her cousin Jules driving. He reined the pony suddenly and viciously before the time-eaten front steps, in order to produce an impression upon those who were gathered around. Most of the men had halted their vehicles outside and permitted their women folk to walk up from the mulberry trees. But the stunning effect was produced when Zaida stepped upon the gallery and threw aside her light shawl in the full glare of half a dozen kerosene lamps. She was white from head to foot, literally, for her slippers even were white. No one would have believed, let alone suspected that they were a pair of old black ones which she had covered with pieces of her first communion sash. There is no describing her dress, it was fluffy, like a fresh powder puff, and stood out. No wonder she had handled it so reverentially. Her white fan was covered with spangles that she herself had sewed all over it, and in her belt and in her brown hair were thrust small sprays of orange blossom. 2 men leaning against the railing uttered long whistles expressive equally of wonder and admiration. Tiens! T'espère comme une Marie, Zaida, cried out a lady with a baby in her arms. Some young women tittered and Zaida fanned herself. The women's voices were almost without exception shrill and piercing, the men's, soft and low-pitched. The girl turned to Telesphore, as to an old and valued friend. Tiens! C'est vous? He had hesitated at first to approach, but at this friendly sign of recognition he drew eagerly forward and held out his hand. The men looked at him suspiciously, inwardly resenting his stylish appearance, which they considered intrusive, offensive and demoralizing. How Zaida's eyes sparkled now! What very pretty teeth Zaida had when she laughed, and what a mouth! Her lips were a revelation, a promise, something to carry away and remember in the night and grow hungry thinking of next day. Strictly speaking, they may not have been quite all that, but in any event, that is the way Telesphore thought about them. He began to take account of her appearance, her nose, her eyes, her hair. And when she left him to go in and dance her first dance with Cousin Jules, he leaned up against a post and thought of them: nose, eyes, hair, ears, lips and round, soft throat. Later it was like bedlam. The musicians had warmed up and were scraping away indoors and calling the figures. Feet were pounding through the dance, dust was flying. The women's voices were piped high and mingled discordantly, like the confused, shrill clatter of waking birds, while the men laughed boisterously. But if someone had only thought of gagging Foch, there would have been less noise. His good humor permeated everywhere, like an atmosphere. He was louder than all the noise. He was more visible than the dust. He called the young mulatto, destined for the knife, my boy, and sent him flying hither and thither. He beamed upon Dut as he tasted the gumbo and congratulated her: "C'est toi que sy connaisse, ma fille, cre tonnerre." Telesphore danced with Zaida and then he leaned out against the post. Then he danced with Zaida, and then he leaned against the post. The mothers of the other girls decided that he had the manners of a pig. It was time to dance again with Zaida and he went in search of her. He was carrying her shawl, which she had given him to hold. "What time it is?" she asked him when he had found and secured her. They were under one of the kerosene lamps on the front gallery and he drew forth his silver watch. She seemed to be still laboring under some suppressed excitement that he had noticed before. "It's 14 minutes pa 12, he told her exactly. "I wish you'd find out where Jules is. Go look yonda in the cardroom if he's there, and come tell me." Jules had danced with all the prettiest girls. She knew it was his custom after accomplishing this agreeable feat, to retire to the cardroom. "You'll wait here till I come back?" he asked. "I'll wait here, you go on." She waited but drew back a little into the shadow. Telesphore lost no time. "Yes, he's yonda playin' cards with Foch and some others I don't know," he reported when he had discovered her in the shadow. There had been a spasm of alarm when he did not at once see her where he had left her under the lamp. "Does he look like he's fixed yonda fo good? He's got his coat off. Looks like he's fixed pretty comfortable fo the next hour or two. Gi me my shawl." "You Cole?" offering to put it around her. "No, I ain't Cole." She drew the shawl about her shoulders and turned as if to leave him. But a sudden generous impulse seemed to move her, and she added, "Come along yonda with me." They descended the few rickety steps that led down to the yard. He followed rather than accompanied her across the beaten and trampled sward. Those who saw them thought they had gone out to take the air. The beams of light that slanted out from the house were fitful and uncertain, deepening the shadows. The embers under the empty gumbo pot glared red in the darkness. There was a sound of quiet voices coming from under the trees. Zaida, closely accompanied by Telesphore, went out where the vehicles and horses were fastened to the fence. She stepped carefully and held up her skirts as if dreading the least speck of dew or of dust. "Unhitch Jules' hoesi and buggy there and turn round this way, please." He did as instructed, first backing the pony, then leading it out to where she stood in the half-made road. "You goin' home?" he asked her. "Betta let me water the pony." "Neva mine." She mounted and seating herself grasped the reins. "No, I ain't goin' home," she added. He, too, was holding the reins gathered in one hand across the pony's back. "Where you goin'?" he demanded. "Neva you mind where I'm goin'. You ain't goin' anywhere this time o' night by yourself? What you reckon I'm 'fraid of?" she laughed. "Turn loose that hoesi," at the same time urging the animal forward. The little brute started away with a bound and Telesphore, also with a bound, sprang into the buckboard and seated himself beside Zaida. "You ain't goin' anywhere this time o' night by yourself." It was not a question now, but an assertion, and there was no denying it. There was even no disputing it, and Zaida recognizing the fact drove on in silence. There is no animal that moves so swiftly across a Acadian prairie as the little Creole pony. This one did not run nor trot, he seemed to reach out in galloping bounds. The buckboard creaked, bounced, jolted and swayed. Zaida clutched at her shawl while Telesphore drew his straw hat further down over his right eye and offered to drive. But he did not know the road and she would not let him. They had soon reached the woods. If there is any animal that can creep more slowly through a wooded road than the little Creole pony, that animal has not yet been discovered in Acadie. This particular animal seemed to be appalled by the darkness of the forest and filled with dejection. His head drooped and he lifted his feet as if each hoof were weighted with 1,000 pounds of lead. Anyone unacquainted with the peculiarities of the breed would sometimes have fancied that he was standing still. But Zaida and Telesphore knew better. Zaida uttered a deep sigh as she slackened her hold on the reins and Telesphore, lifting his hat, let it swing from the back of his head. "How you don, ask me where I'm goin'," she said finally. These were the first words she had spoken since refusing his offer to drive. "Oh, it don make any difference where you goin'. Then if it don make any difference where I'm goin', I just as well tell you." She hesitated, however. He seemed to have no curiosity and did not urge her. "I'm goin' to get married," she said. He uttered some kind of an exclamation. It was nothing articulate, more like the tone of an animal that gets a sudden knife thrust. And now he felt how dark the forest was. An instant before it had seemed a sweet, black paradise, better than any heaven he had ever heard of. "Why can't you get married at home?" This was not the first thing that occurred to him to say, but this was the first thing he said. "Ah, bien oui. With perfect mules fo, a father and mother. It's good enough to talk. Why couldn't he come and get you? What kind of a scoundrel is that to let you go through the woods at night by yourself? You better wait till you know who you talkin' about. He didn't come and get me because he knows I ain't afraid, and because he's got too much pride to ride in Jules Trodan's buckboard after he done been put out o' Jules Trodan's house. What's his name and where you goin' to find him? Yonda on the other side the woods up at ol' what Gibson's, a kind of justice the peace or something. Anyhow he's goin' to marry us. And after we done married those testimulets yonda on Bayou de Glaise can say what they want. What's his name? André Pascal." The name meant nothing to Telesphore. For all he knew, André Pascal might be one of the shining lights of Avoyelles, but he doubted it. "You better turn roun'," he said. It was an unselfish impulse that prompted the suggestion. It was the thought of this girl married to a man whom even Jules Trodan would not suffer to enter his house. "I done give my word," she answered. "What's the matter with him? Why don't yo' father and mother want you to marry him? Why? Because it's always the same tune. When a man's down everybody's got stones to throw at him. They say he's lazy. A man that will walk from St. Landry Plum to Rapides lookin' fo work, and they call that lazy. Then, somebody's been spreadin' yonda on the bayou that he drinks. I don' believe it. I neva saw him drinkin', me. Anyway, he won't drink after he's married to me, he's too fond of me fo that. He say he'll blow out his brains if I don' marry him. I reckon you better turn roun'. No, I done give my word." And they went creeping on through the woods in silence. "What time is it?" she asked after an interval. He lit a match and looked at his watch. "It's 1:15. What time did he say?" "I told him I'd come about 1 o'clock. I knew that was a good time to get away from the ball." She would have hurried a little but the pony could not be induced to do so. He dragged himself, seemingly ready at any moment to give up the breath of life. But once out of the woods he made up for lost time. They were on the open prairie again, and he fairly ripped the air. Some flying demon must have changed skins with him. It was a few minutes of 1 o'clock when they drew up before what Gibson's house. It was not much more than a rude shelter, and in the dim starlight it seemed isolated, as if standing alone in the middle of the black, far-reaching prairie. As they halted at the gate, a dog within set up a furious barking, and an old negro who had been smoking his pipe at that ghostly hour, advanced toward them from the shelter of the gallery. Telesphore descended and helped his companion to alight. "We want to see Mr. Gibson," spoke up Zaida. The old fellow had already opened the gate. There was no light in the house. "Moss Gibson, he yonda to ol' Mr. Bottles playin' cards. But he neva stay atter 1 o'clock. Come in, ma'am, come in, Sue, walk right long in." He had drawn his own conclusions to explain their appearance. They stood upon the narrow porch waiting while he went inside to light the lamp. Although the house was small, as it comprised but one room, that room was comparatively a large one. It looked to Telesphore and Zaida very large and gloomy when they entered it. The lamp was on a table that stood against the wall, and that held further a rusty-looking ink bottle, a pen and an old blank book. A narrow bed was off in the corner. The brick chimney extended into the room and formed a ledge that served as mantel shelf. From the big, low-hanging rafters swung an assortment of fishing tackle, a gun, some discarded articles of clothing and a string of red peppers. The boards of the floor were broad, rough and loosely joined together. Telesphore and Zaida seated themselves on opposite sides of the table, and the negro went out to the wood pile to gather chips and pieces of bois gras with which to kindle a small fire. It was a little chilly. He supposed the two would want coffee, and he knew that what Gibson would ask for a cup the first thing on his arrival. "I wonder what's keepin' him," muttered Zaida impatiently. Telesphore looked at his watch. He had been looking at it at intervals of 1 minute straight along. "It's 10 minutes pa 1, he said. He offered no further comment. At 12 minutes past 1 Zaida's restlessness again broke into speech. "I can't imagine, me, what's become of Andre. He said he'd be your show at 1. The old negro was kneeling before the fire that he had kindled, contemplating the cheerful blaze. He rolled his eyes toward Zaida. "You talkin' 'bout Mr. Andre Pascal? No need to look fo him. Mr. Andre he been down to de pint all day raisin' cane." "That's a lie," said Zaida. Telesphore said nothing. "'Tain't no lie, ma'am, he been show raisin' de ol' Nick." She looked at him, too contemptuous to reply. The negro told no lie so far as his bald statement was concerned. He was simply mistaken in his estimate of André Pascal's ability to raise Cain during an entire afternoon and evening and still keep a rendezvous with a lady at 1 o'clock in the morning. For André was even then at hand, as the loud and menacing howl of the dog testified. The negro hastened out to admit him. André did not enter at once. He stayed a while outside, abusing the dog and communicating to the negro his intention of coming out to shoot the animal after he had attended to more pressing business that was awaiting him within. Zaida arose, a little flurried and excited when he entered. Telesphore remained seated. Pascal was partially sober. There had evidently been an attempt at dressing for the occasion at some early part of the previous day, but such evidences had almost wholly vanished. His linen was soiled and his whole appearance was that of a man who, by an effort, had aroused himself from a debauch. He was a little taller than Telesphore, and more loosely put together. Most women would have called him a handsomer man. It was easy to imagine that when sober, he might betray by some subtle grace of speech or manner, evidences of gentle blood. "Why did you keep me waitin', André?" You knew." She got no further, but backed up against the table and stared at him with earnest, startled eyes. "Keep you waiting, Zaida? My dear Lilo Zaide, how can you say such a thing? I started up here an hour ago and where's that damned old Gibson?" He had approached Zaida with the evident intention of embracing her, but she seized his wrist and held him at arm's length away. In casting his eyes about for old Gibson, his glance alighted upon Telesphore. The sight of the Acadian seemed to fill him with astonishment. He stood back and began to contemplate the young fellow and lose himself in speculation and conjecture before him, as if before some unlabeled wax figure. He turned for information to Zaida. "Say, Zaida, what you call this? What kind of damn fool you got sitting here? Who let him in? What you reckon he's looking for? Trouble?" Telesphore said nothing. He was awaiting his cue from Zaida. "André Pascal," she said, "you just as well take the do and go. You might stand here till the day o' judgment on yo knees befo me. And blow out yo brains if you a mind to. I ain't never goin' to marry you. The hell you ain't." He had hardly more than uttered the words when he lay prone on his back. Telesphore had knocked him down. The blow seemed to complete the process of sobering that had begun in him. He gathered himself together and rose to his feet. In doing so he reached back for his pistol. His hold was not yet steady, however, and the weapon slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor. Zaida picked it up and laid it on the table behind her. She was going to see fair play. The brute instinct that drives men at each other's throat was awake and stirring in these two. Each saw in the other a thing to be wiped out of his way, out of existence if need be. Passion and blind rage directed the blows which they dealt, and steeled the tension of muscles and clutch of fingers. They were not skillful blows, however. The fire blazed cheerily. The kettle which the Negro had placed upon the coals was steaming and singing. The man had gone in search of his master. Zaida had placed the lamp out of harm's way on the high mantel ledge and she leaned back with her hands behind her upon the table. She did not raise her voice or lift her finger to stay the combat that was acting before her. She was motionless, and white to the lips, only her eyes seemed to be alive and burning and blazing. At one moment she felt that André must have strangled Telesphore, but she said nothing. The next instant she could hardly doubt that the blow from Telesphore's doubled fist could be less than a killing one, but she did nothing. How the loose boards swayed and creaked beneath the weight of the struggling men. The very old rafters seemed to groan, and she felt that the house shook. The combat, if fierce, was short, and it ended out on the gallery whither they had staggered through the open door, or one had dragged the other, she could not tell. But she knew when it was over, for there was a long moment of utter stillness. Then she heard one of the men descend the steps and go away, for the gate slammed after him. The other went out to the cistern. The sound of the tin bucket splashing in the water reached her where she stood. He must have been endeavoring to remove traces of the encounter. Presently Telesphore entered the room. The elegance of his apparel had been somewhat marred. The men over at the Acadian ball would hardly have taken exception now to his appearance. "Where is André?" the girl asked. "He's gone," said Telesphore. She had never changed her position and now when she drew herself up her wrists ached and she rubbed them a little. She was no longer pale, the blood had come back into her cheeks and lips, staining them crimson. She held out her hand to him. He took it gratefully enough, but he did not know what to do with it. That is, he did not know what he might dare to do with it, so he let it drop gently away and went to the fire. "I reckon we better be goin', too," she said. He stooped and poured some of the bubbling water from the kettle upon the coffee which the Negro had set upon the hearth. "I'll make a leetle coffee furs," he proposed, "and anyhow we better wait till old man what's his name comes back. It wouldn't look well to leave his house that way without some kind of excuse or explanation." She made no reply, but seated herself submissively beside the table. Her will, which had been overmastering and aggressive, seemed to have grown numb under the disturbing spell of the past few hours. An illusion had gone from her, and had carried her love with it. The absence of regret revealed this to her. She realized, but could not comprehend it, not knowing that the love had been part of the illusion. She was tired in body and spirit, and it was with a sense of restfulness that she sat all drooping and relaxed and watched Telesphore make the coffee. He made enough for them both and a cup for old Wat Gibson when he should come in, and also one for the Negro. He supposed the cups, the sugar and spoons were in the safe over there in the corner, and that is where he found them. When he finally said to Zaida, "Come, I'm going to take you home now," and drew her shawl around her, pinning it under the chin. She was like a little child and followed whither he led in all confidence. It was Telesphore who drove on the way back, and he let the pony cut no capers, but held him to a steady and tempered gait. The girl was still quiet and silent. She was thinking tenderly, a little tearfully of those two old têtes de mulets yonder on Bayou de Glaise. How they crept through the woods. And how dark it was and how still. "What time it is?" whispered Zaida. Alas! He could not tell her, his watch was broken. But almost for the first time in his life, Telesphore did not care what time it was. Nég Créole. At the remote period of his birth he had been named César François Xavier, but no one ever thought of calling him anything but Chiquet, or Nég, or Maringouin. Down at the French market, where he worked among the fishmongers, they called him Chiquet, when they were not calling him names that are written less freely than they are spoken. But one felt privileged to call him almost anything, he was so black, lean, lame, and shriveled. He wore a head kerchief, and whatever other rags the fishermen and their wives chose to bestow upon him. Throughout one whole winter he wore a woman's discarded jacket with puffed sleeves. Among some startling beliefs entertained by Chiquet was one that Michi Saint Pierre et Michi Saint Paul had created him. Of Michi Bon Dieu he held his own private opinion, and not a too flattering one at that. This fantastic notion concerning the origin of his being he owed to the early teaching of his young master, a lax believer, and a great farceur in his day. Chiquet had once been thrashed by a robust young Irish priest for expressing his religious views, and at another time knifed by a Sicilian. So he had come to hold his peace upon that subject. Upon another theme he talked freely and harped continuously. For years he had tried to convince his associates that his master had left a progeny, rich, cultured, powerful, and numerous beyond belief. This prosperous race of beings inhabited the most imposing mansions in the city of New Orleans. Men of note and position, whose names were familiar to the public, he swore were grandchildren, great-grandchildren, or, less frequently, distant relatives of his master, long deceased. Ladies who came to the market in carriages, or whose elegance of attire attracted the attention and admiration of the fish women, were all de tites cousines to his former master, Jean Boisdeur. He never looked for recognition from any of these superior beings, but delighted to discourse by the hour upon their dignity and pride of birth and wealth. Chiquet always carried an old gunny sack, and into this went his earnings. He cleaned stalls at the market, scaled fish, and did many odd offices for the itinerant merchants, who usually paid in trade for his service. Occasionally he saw the color of silver and got his clutch upon a coin, but he accepted anything, and seldom made terms. He was glad to get a handkerchief from the Hebrew, and grateful if the Choctaws would trade him a bottle of file for it. The butcher flung him a soup bone, and the fishmonger a few crabs or a paper bag of shrimps. It was the big muletresse, vendeuse de café, who cared for his inner man. Once Chiquet was accused by a shoe vendor of attempting to steal a pair of ladies' shoes. He declared he was only examining them. The clamor raised in the market was terrific. Young Dagos assembled and squealed like rats, a couple of Gascon butchers bellowed like bulls. Mateo's wife shook her fist in the accuser's face and called him incomprehensible names. The Choctaw women, where they squatted, turned their slow eyes in the direction of the fray, taking no further notice. While a policeman jerked Chiquet around by the puffed sleeve and brandished a club. It was a narrow escape. Nobody knew where Chiquet lived. A man, even a Nég Créole, who lives among the reeds and willows of Bayou St. John, in a deserted chicken coop constructed chiefly of tarred paper, is not going to boast of his habitation or to invite attention to his domestic appointments. When, after market hours, he vanished in the direction of St. Philip Street, limping, seemingly bent under the weight of his gunny bag. It was like the disappearance from the stage of some petty actor whom the audience does not follow in imagination beyond the wings, or think of till his return in another scene. There was one to whom Chiquet's coming or going meant more than this. In La Maison Grise they called her La Chouette, for no earthly reason unless that she perched high under the roof of the old rookery and scolded in shrill sudden outbursts. 40 or 50 years before, when for a little while she acted minor parts with a company of French players, an escapade that had brought her grandmother to the grave. She was known as Mademoiselle de Montalane. 75 years before she had been christened Agli Boisdure. No matter at what hour the old Negro appeared at her threshold, Mademoiselle Agli always kept him waiting till she finished her prayers. She opened the door for him and silently motioned him to a seat, returning to prostrate herself upon her knees before a crucifix, and a shell filled with holy water that stood on a small table. It represented in her imagination an altar. Chiquet knew that she did it to aggravate him. He was convinced that she timed her devotions to begin when she heard his footsteps on the stairs. He would sit with sullen eyes contemplating her long, spare, poorly clad figure as she knelt and read from her book or finished her prayers. Bitter was the religious warfare that had raged for years between them, and Mademoiselle Agli had grown, on her side, as intolerant as Chiquet. She had come to hold Saint Peter and St. Paul in such utter detestation that she had cut their pictures out of her prayer book. Then Mademoiselle Agli pretended not to care what Chiquet had in his bag. He drew forth a small hunk of beef and laid it in her basket that stood on the bare floor. She looked from the corner of her eye, and went on dusting the table. He brought out a handful of potatoes, some pieces of sliced fish, a few herbs, a yard of calico, and a small pat of butter wrapped in lettuce leaves. He was proud of the butter, and wanted her to notice it. He held it out and asked her for something to put it on. She handed him a saucer, and looked indifferent and resigned, with lifted eyebrows. Pas de sucre, Nég? Chiquet shook his head and scratched it, and looked like a black picture of distress and mortification. No sugar. But tomorrow he would get a pinch here and a pinch there, and would bring as much as a cupful. Mademoiselle Agli then sat down, and talked to Chiquet uninterruptedly and confidentially. She complained bitterly, and it was all about a pain that lodged in her leg. That crept and acted like a live, stinging serpent, twining about her waist and up her spine, and coiling round the shoulder blade. And then less rheumatisms in her fingers. He could see for himself how they were knotted. She could not bend them, she could hold nothing in her hands, and had let a saucer fall that morning and broken it in pieces. And if she were to tell him that she had slept a wink through the night, she would be a liar, deserving of perdition. She had sat at the window la nuit blanche, hearing the hours strike and the market wagons rumble. Chiquet nodded, and kept up a running fire of sympathetic comment and suggestive remedies for rheumatism and insomnia, herbs, or tisanes, or gris-gris, or all three. As if he knew. There was Purgatory Mary, a perambulating soul whose office in life was to pray for the shades in purgatory. She had brought Mademoiselle Agli a bottle of eau de Lourdes, but so little of it. She might have kept her water of Lourdes, for all the good it did, a drop. Not so much as would cure a fly or a mosquito. Mademoiselle Agli was going to show Purgatory Mary the door when she came again, not only because of her avarice with the Lourdes water, but, beside that, she brought in on her feet dirt that could only be removed with a shovel after she left. And Mademoiselle Agli wanted to inform Chiquet that there would be slaughter and bloodshed in La Maison Grise if the people below stairs did not mend their ways. She was convinced that they lived for no other purpose than to torture and molest her. The woman kept a bucket of dirty water constantly on the landing with the hope of Mademoiselle Agli falling over it or into it. And she knew that the children were instructed to gather in the hall and on the stairway, and scream and make a noise and jump up and down like galloping horses, with the intention of driving her to suicide. Chiquet should notify the policemen on the beat, and have them arrested, if possible, and thrust into the parish prison, where they belonged. Chiquet would have been extremely alarmed if he had ever chanced to find Mademoiselle Agli in an uncomplaining mood. It never occurred to him that she might be otherwise. He felt that she had a right to quarrel with fate, if ever mortal had. Her poverty was a disgrace, and he hung his head before it and felt ashamed. One day he found Mademoiselle Agli stretched on the bed, with her head tied up in a handkerchief. Her sole complaint that day was, "Aie, aie, aie." "Aie, aie, aie," uttered with every breath. He had seen her so before, especially when the weather was damp. "Vous pas besoin tisane, Mademoiselle Agli? Vous pas vraiment cri gagni docteur?" She desired nothing. "Aie, aie, aie." He emptied his bag very quietly, so as not to disturb her, and he wanted to stay there with her and lie down on the floor in case she needed him, but the woman from below had come up. She was an Irish woman with rolled sleeves. "It's a stout shtick I'm after giving her, Nég, and she do but knock on the floor. It's me or Janie or one of us that'll be hearing her. You too good, Bridget. Aie, aie, aie. Un good do sucre, Nég. That purgatory Marie, you see her, ma bonne Bridget, you tell her go say Lilo prayer là-bas au cathedral, aie, aie, aie." Nég could hear her lamentation as he descended the stairs. It followed him as he limped his way through the city streets, and seemed part of the city's noise. He could hear it in the rumble of wheels and jangle of car bells, and in the voices of those passing by. He stopped at Mamat the Voodoo's shanty and bought a gree-gree, a cheap one for 15 cents. Mamat held her charms at all prices. This he intended to introduce next day into Mademoiselle Anglie's room, somewhere about the altar, to the confusion and discomfort of Michi Bon Dieu, who persistently declined to concern himself with the welfare of a boy's doer. At night, among the reeds on the bayou, Chiquet could still hear the woman's wail, mingled now with the croaking of the frogs. If he could have been convinced that giving up his life down there in the water would in any way have bettered her condition, he would not have hesitated to sacrifice the remnant of his existence that was wholly devoted to her. He lived but to serve her. He did not know it himself, but Chiquet knew so little, and that little in such a distorted way. He could scarcely have been expected, even in his most lucid moments, to give himself over to self-analysis. Chiquet gathered an uncommon amount of dainties at market the following day. He had to work hard, and scheme and whine a little, but he got hold of an orange and a lump of ice and a chou-fleur. He did not drink his cup of café au lait, but asked Mimi Lambeau to put it in the little new tin pail that the Hebrew notion vendor had just given him in exchange for a mess of shrimps. This time, however, Chiquet had his trouble for nothing. When he reached the upper room of La Maison Grise, it was to find that Mademoiselle Agli had died during the night. He set his bag down in the middle of the floor, and stood shaking, and whined low like a dog in pain. Everything had been done. The Irish woman had gone for the doctor, and Purgatory Mary had summoned a priest. Furthermore, the woman had arranged Mademoiselle Agli decently. She had covered the table with a white cloth, and had placed it at the head of the bed, with the crucifix and 2 lighted candles in silver candlesticks upon it. The little bit of ornamentation brightened and embellished the poor room. Purgatory Mary, dressed in shabby black, fat and breathing hard, sat reading half audibly from a prayer book. She was watching the dead and the silver candlesticks, which she had borrowed from a benevolent society, and for which she held herself responsible. A young man was just leaving, a reporter snuffing the air for items, who had scented one up there in the top room of La Maison Grise. All the morning Janie had been escorting a procession of street Arabs up and down the stairs to view the remains. One of them, a little girl, who had had her face washed and had made a species of toilet for the occasion, refused to be dragged away. She stayed seated as if at an entertainment, fascinated alternately by the long, still figure of Mademoiselle Agli, the mumbling lips of Purgatory Mary, and the silver candlesticks. "Will ye get down on your knees, man, and say a prayer for the dead?" commanded the woman. But Chiquet only shook his head, and refused to obey. He approached the bed, and laid a little black paw for a moment on the stiffened body of Mamselle Agli. There was nothing for him to do here. He picked up his old ragged hat and his bag and went away. "The black Athen," the woman muttered. "Shut the door, child." The little girl slid down from her chair, and went on tiptoe to shut the door which Schicket had left open. Having resumed her seat, she fastened her eyes upon Purgatory Mary's heaving chest. "You, Schicket," cried Matteo's wife the next morning. "My man," he read in paper, "'bout woman name Boisdur, use belong to big A family. She die rune on St. Philip, say may like church rat. It's any them Boisturs you alla talk 'bout?" Schicket shook his head in slow but emphatic denial. No, indeed, the woman was not of kin to his Boisturs. He surely had told Matteo's wife often enough. How many times did he have to repeat it, of their wealth, their social standing? It was doubtless some Boisdur of Les Attacapis, it was none of his. The next day there was a small funeral procession passing a little distance away, a hearse and a carriage or two. There was the priest who had attended Mamselle Agli, and a benevolent Creole gentleman whose father had known the Boisturs in his youth. There was a couple of player folk, who, having got wind of the story, had thrust their hands into their pockets. "Look, Schicket," cried Matteo's wife. "Yonda go the funal. Musée be that a Boisdur woman we tal ken 'bout yesterday." But Schicket paid no heed. What was to him the funeral of a woman who had died in St. Philip Street? He did not even turn his head in the direction of the moving procession. He went on scaling his red snapper.